Hello everybody, welcome back to another video on my attempt to rise to 2400. I am going to cover a game which was played a few days ago for the sort of Four Nations Chess League in the UK. This game was played on Tuesday at 7:30. It's actually Thursday morning, about 3 in the morning. I haven't been able to sleep very well, so I'll be covering this match. The reason I didn't show it live is because there are some potential issues with recording the game as it happens. I might be accused of doing something unethical, potentially, and there are certain rules that are enforced very strictly. So to avoid all that, I'm analysing the game after it has been played. You can already see, if you look over here, the result of the game, or you can guess, most likely. It says white resigned, so black won. I was playing on top board in Division 2. Basically, the way it works is I believe there's about 20 teams, and in Division 2, at the end of the kind of season, at the end of the league, you then have the top 4 get promoted to the top division, which will have mostly title players like IMs and GMs and FMs. Then the next 12 teams will just stay in the same division, and the bottom 4 teams will get relegated to Division 3, where usually the strongest players will be like 2,000, maybe 2,100, or you might very rarely get like an FM playing, but it's maybe 1 at most. So Division 2, I'm fairly happy in Division 2, but you know, there is always the dream of Division 1 where I'll just get absolutely destroyed on top board. I'll be playing Grandmasters basically every round. So anyway, in the first game back, I was playing someone who's about 2150. They played d4. And I thought I'd try something different, play f5. And they respond c4. This is the mainline Dutch. And sometimes I play e6 here, which is a kind of recommendation of Simon Williams, the Ginger GM. He actually, I believe, recommends e6 at move 1, if I'm being totally honest, and then to play f5. So e6 first, then f5, and that stops white going bishop g5 on move 2. So you can get this move in. And then play things like knight f6 and just go into the mainline Dutch systems. And I think that's recommended in his Killer Dutch repertoire. But I instead played knight f6. This is a flexible move. It gives me lots and lots of options. I can play g6, e6, d6 on my next turn. A couple of other moves as well, but those are the main ones. My opponent played knight c3, and I now proceeded to play g6. And this line's a little bit unusual. It has definitely still been played, but I think in retrospect I probably would have just gone with e6. And after white develops, black can, get a relatively okay position here. So black will castle very early. White will usually develop and then play things like e3, and black in the future can play things like knight to e4. And I've even seen players fianchetto with b6 and bishop b7 in order to get the bishop out. This bishop is the problem piece. The other idea is to move the d pawn and then slide the bishop around with bishop d7, and then e8 and h5 sometimes to get the bishop out. So it's like a reverse kind of bird's opening for white, except black never has the option of pushing their e-pawn to move alongside the f-pawn. It's pretty much the only plan to go knight e4 at some point. If white can stop knight to e4, black will have to really maneuver around a lot to stop that. Anyway, if you want to know a lot more about the Dutch, I would suggest Simon Williams. He's a very strong grandmaster. He's an attacking player. He got a lot of experience in these types of positions. He knows a lot more about it than me. But for what it's worth, I played g6, which is I believe it's called the St. Petersburg Dutch. Usually the St. Petersburg is without knight f6, so it's just f5, d4, g6. So this might technically be a Leningrad, but in the way it plays out, it's just not a very good one. So part of my idea there is to fianchetto early and then play castles, then decide what to do with my centre. Either play d6, e5, get my e-pawn alongside the f-pawn, or to play sort of e6 and d6 and then sort of like knight bd7 or something and try and get e5 later. And this plan allows me to fianchetto and castle faster than just playing d6 on move 3. The downside is that h4 is a very, very strong move for white. I can't really do a lot, so I played d6. I recognised the danger, so I tried striking in the centre, a la Nimzovich. You know, when one side attacks on the wing, you attack in the centre with a counter-attack. h5. Now it's really starting to go downhill. If I play bishop g7, I actually had this position against Richard Tozer, I think, who's an IM, and we played a sort of slightly controversial game in a congress. I can't remember which one it was. St Albans, that was it, St Albans Congress. Whereas white, I played this system and I got a kind of okay position. Then some weird stuff happened, and it probably should have been a drawn match, but I ended up losing eventually. But anyway, after bishop g7, white can take the pawn, trade rooks and get a good position, or you can go h6, just I believe what I had played in the game when I was white. Force the bishop back to where it started, and that bishop on f8 is now stuck. White's gained a lot of time. Got a pawn on h6, very, very strong pawn, and then white can develop very easily. So for that reason, as black, I took the pawn. And I believe e4 is the most common move, striking in the centre. But instead, rook takes h5, pawn takes h5. White's lost the exchange, but after e4, what would you play in this position if you were black? So if you think you should take the pawn on e4 to remove white's central pawns, this is an idea that might be good strategically, but for tactical reasons it can't work. Allowing the white queen to come in, harass the king. There's all sorts of horrible checks and stuff coming up. Possibly even similar to the game, d5 might even be very strong here. But I'm sure that this is very, very strong for white. Queen f5 will at least have a draw. Queen f5, king e8, queen back to h5. So I know that's a draw at the very least. But d5 could be very strong, as well as just simple developing moves like knight h3 or knight g to e2. And as you can see, none of black's pieces are coordinated at all. So what I did in the game to try and avoid this was I played bishop e6, so that if queen takes h5, check, I can block with the bishop. And even though I'll lose the pawn in this line, I can then play things like e6, force the queen back, and you know I do have chances here. Something like queen d7, and I've developed two pieces. I've got my queen and bishop out. I've also got moves like knight to a6 and castle's queenside, and rook g8 as well is a move. White will have given up the exchange for just a pawn. I think black should at least be level here, because white doesn't really have enough development to take advantage of black, I don't think anyway. But instead they played a line here with bishop e2, and when I was playing this out, I suddenly remembered there was a game that I'd seen before in this position, but I could not remember who it was. I thought it might have been Wesley So, but at least according to, I think, chesstempo.com, which is a site that's quite useful for researching openings up to about move 10. Apparently this is a game Topalov against Polgar from sometime in the 2000s. And I think Polgar won the match, but was completely losing in the opening. So I played bishop f7 to stop checks, bishop takes, and apparently I shouldn't take the bishop because it will lead me into a position like the one we've seen earlier with their queen coming out. Apparently I should play like queen d7 or pawn e6. Then if bishop takes bishop and king takes, queen h5, and the king actually isn't that bad off. I should not play king e7. Why not? Why is this a terrible move? Yeah, white goes bishop g5 with a skewer, so I will definitely lose the queen. But instead, something like king g8, surprisingly enough, white's actually not completely winning. It's still very good for white. I'd probably pick white over black. But then again, it's a kind of position where black potentially can play this. Escape with their life, escape with the king not being totally done in, and the material may prove to be enough for black to sort of grind a win. But I took the bishop, white took back, king d7. Now if queen takes f5, I have e6, which could be useful to repel the queen. I think here white should probably develop. According to computers, moving their knight on g1 is very good. But bishop g5 is also an interesting line. It prevents the black pawn moving to e6. Computers, of course, recommend trading queens, which is a sound strategic idea. Trade queens when you're ahead on material. I thought white would go queen h3, and apparently e6 is still okay. The reason being that if white takes on f5, black takes back on f5, and it's check. So black can't directly win f5. So after castle's queenside, I think it's bishop g7. And then even though white's going to win f5, again black can offer the trade of queens. So white is not actually winning by that much. And if queen check, there's king c8, which will be a theme in this game. King is surprisingly safe on the c-file. All that remains to be done is to get the b8 knight and a8 rook into the game. Once that's done, black actually has a very good position. So instead, to try and prevent that, after king d7, white played d5, so going directly for queen takes f5 check, the very, very minimum drawing. And what I did, I think is a good move actually. This is roughly the point at which Topalov-Polgar diverted in this path. Can't totally remember the game, but I don't think d5 was chosen. I think instead it was like knight f3 or something that Topalov played. Anyway, my memory of the position is not that clear, but I think king c8 is a good move. What it does is it improves my king, so always improve pieces. It also potentially gives my knight and queen a square on d7 to move to. And after white plays knight h3 to try and swing it to either e6 or f7, which will be either an octopus knight on e6 or a fork on f7, via say g5 or f4, I don't think I can take on e4. It still looks too slow. White will quickly get their knight to one of those squares. So instead I improve the worst piece, the bishop on g7. Now it maybe can double white's pawns on the c-file. Queen takes check. What would you play here? Would you play knight d7 or queen d7 to block the check? So knight d7 I'm sure is an okay move. It looks reasonable, you develop the knight, improve your position. But the thing is, after knight g5, I wasn't liking rook f8 so much, because a queen takes h7 maybe, or just queen drops back and then you take on h7. And knight e6 is still a threat. And if I go queen f8, then maybe just something like queen h3. Knight to e6 is still on the horizons. And I really want to trade queens, but it's not easy to do here. That's partly why I played queen d7. If white takes me, I'll take the knight. Instead they dropped back to not lose the queen. And then a quick knight to a6. This move is, again, it's sort of designed to quickly develop the pieces. I think rook f8 might be a good alternative, but I wasn't totally sure about queen h5 coming up. Although the best move is something I didn't even consider, because it was a pawn move. Apparently, according to a computer, h5 is very, very strong. The reason for this is that if white goes bishop e3, I can try to achieve my strategic goal of trading queens, queen g4. And if white plays, say, queen f7, I might be able to take on g2 and actually have threats. That's what I missed, h5. So the strategic idea there was sound, trade queens. I hadn't noticed I could kind of force the queens off so easily. I thought there'd always be a way for white to avoid the trade. Potentially they might have something like king f1 here, so that if queen g4 they can run to d3, but then rook f8 would be very good for me to actually get an attack on their king. So h5 would give me an advantage. Instead, knight a6, developing pieces, always trying to improve. Knight f4, knight c5, so I'm preventing knight to e6 from being played. That to me felt like white's best strategic place for their knight. So what you may have noticed so far is that I'm trying to play strategically in the sense of in a static position I will try to improve my piece placement, always improve the worst piece, and just kind of remove tactics from white's position because they have the initiative, they've got the extra space. They've got better development of their pieces, better coordination. So if I can remove tactics, that will then just put me on a good footing for the ending. But with that h5 move, what I haven't been fully appreciating is the plan stage. So I've been just sort of thinking in simple terms, not entirely on the highest level of thinking. All I've been planning to do is sort of improve pieces, and I haven't really thought a lot further than that. As long as I improve them, put them on good squares, and ideally prevent white doing what they want to do, I'll have a good position. What I'm forgetting to do is plan. I haven't really planned what I'm doing with the pieces once they've got to seemingly good squares. How do I coordinate? Where am I attacking? So I think for that reason, that h5 move on move 14 earlier was much better, because it showed exactly where I was attacking, kingside, preventing white's tactics by trading off queens and improving my queen and potentially my rook as well. So this may have cost me some advantage. White plays bishop d2. I think the plan is simply to castle, and I don't really have a good way to prevent that. So I played rook f8 with a minor tactic here. If white plays b4, which looks like a good move at first because you are removing the knight from its ideal placement, this move is actually a mistake. Can you see the continuation I had planned? If you did see it, well done. It now switches to a dynamic tactical game because of the b2 pawn moving to b4, giving my bishop on g7 a good line to the rook. I can play bishop takes knight. White has to recapture the bishop. If they don't, I'll take the rook. And if they move the rook, I'll just win a piece. So they have to take. If they take with the bishop, that will lead to the fun tactic. If they take with the queen, though, I can simply capture on e4. And I've won a pawn, I can trade off more pieces, and the more pieces I trade, the closer I get to a winning ending. So the queen will move, and I can trade the knight for bishop. This has a lot of potential to give me a completely winning ending. But you may be thinking, why not bishop takes? If you've already seen it, well done. If you haven't seen it, I'll give you about 10 more seconds. Try to find black's best move on the board. The move is a kind of deflection or removing the guard idea. Rook takes f4, grabbing the knight. White can't take black's knight because they'll lose the queen. And they can't move the queen away because the knight will live and escape. So they have to take the rook to keep material level. But then there's a fork, knight d3 check, winning the queen. So at minimum I win a pawn if they do queen takes knight in... sorry, queen takes bishop in this position. But if they take with the bishop, they lose straight away. Castles was played instead. I think that's a very solid move. It helps white develop all their pieces. And now b4 could actually be a move. The reason is that eventually when my knight tries to land on d3, their rook will be stopping me. So their idea of b4 will actually work. That's why I played a5, keeping my knight on c5. It's a very good square for the knight. King b1. And I'm not sure about my next move. I really wanted to get my rooks connected together. And the way to do that, in my head, was to move the king out the way. Now, I might have the right kind of idea, but I might have executed it wrong. I played b6 to play king b7. This caused me a few problems later in the game, and to be honest, it's a pawn move. It's not really improving a piece that well. It takes me 2 moves to get the king, it's sort of more positioned where he should be. So perhaps I should move something else. I mean, king b8 is a potential move, with king a7 being there. Perhaps it doesn't make much difference, but I did feel a bit uneasy playing b6. Rook h1. Because of white playing king b1, I no longer have any knight d3 ideas. But trading pieces is the right kind of plan, so I took the knight, they took back, then e5 was chosen. What does white play here to not lose a piece? The move they play is pawn takes e6, because I move 2 squares I can do the en passant capture. I take back with the knight, and g3 to protect their pinned knight. And another reason for me doing that trade was so that the queen on d7 was guarding h7. I don't really want to lose the h-pawn and give white a passed g-pawn. That could be very useful, and may even tip the scales a bit in black's favour. I now play king b7 with a little trepidation, but I do see the tactics. After e5 check, if queen c6, that would be a huge blunder, because of queen takes queen on c6, king takes back, the knight's no longer pinned to anything relevant, so knight takes knight would be winning for white. Instead, I play king to a7. Now my king is very safe. Then queen e4 gets out the pin, and I capture the pawn, trying to open the centre as much as I can, which will give my rooks a lot of power. My opponent trades knights, and has managed to get their rook active. It's a very good play from my opponent. Now it's difficult for me to win this. I still think I might have a small advantage due to my 2 rooks. So what I do is to get my queen to guard on c7, also to have a threat, queen d1 mate, so the e5 is unavailable to be taken. After white's play a3, I can defend the pawn with rook a to e8. At move 27 I finally developed all of my pieces. But if we go back a move, why shouldn't white play b3? It defends their pawn on c4, makes a pawn chain. The king might still have a good escape route via b2 and a3. And, you know, for the ending, your pawns are on light squares, bishops are on dark squares, so you're controlling more of the board. Why is this move wrong? What does black do in this position? So you do need to visualize quite far ahead. First move, well, you could do rook takes f2 as well. And queen d1 is also a very nice move. King to b2 is practically forced. Rook takes f2. King a3. Now you have to be very careful, because if black doesn't check in the next couple of moves, it will be winning for white because of rook takes c7. So if you thought queen c1, king to a4, queen takes c3, that is incorrect. Rook takes c7, and then wherever the black king goes, queen b7 mate. So the difficult move you have to see is that after king to a3, you can actually retreat the queen to d6 with all the checks. White doesn't have a good way out. If king to a4, rook takes a2 mate, and after b4, pawn takes a3 double check. Oh, sorry, single check. Sorry, king bishop takes, and then. Oh, hold on. I thought the king was somewhere else. I'm gonna have to. What on earth did I have? Try to remember now. I think it is still completely winning, but I'm trying to remember the most clinical way of playing it, because I'm not entirely sure I remember the most clinical way of playing. That was it, yes, because it was either queen d1, which is a move I did think of. Yeah, because if king to b8, it's actually about level, because the queen takes rook. King takes, and then bishop takes queen. So I'd seen this, and it's actually slightly better for white, if anything. But I actually thought that queen, queen d1. I didn't see it was -11. That's more than I thought it would be. What I saw was that if white took on c7, check, I would now have king b8 with discovered check on the king, and it would be mating them, or they would just lose a queen. So what I did was, by forcing them to move the a pawn, I take, they take, and if they move the king, it's terrible. Pawn takes, bishop is good enough. And yeah, because of the a file being open, I don't fall for rook takes c7 mating me, because they don't have enough time to do the mate. And yeah, queen d6 is apparently the best computer move as well. That's what I thought of. I think it might be the only move, actually, that gives me an advantage. Very briefly, if I look here, apparently rook to c8 or even b5 is still, a very good position for me. Yeah, -4. So it wasn't necessary for me to do queen d6, but it was a lot bigger of an advantage after b3. So I had seen queen d6 and then takes, and then queen d1 with ideas of mating them on the a file if they check me on c7. But that doesn't happen. They don't play b3. They play a3. Rook a to e8. Then unfortunately they play f3 here. Just turning the computer notes off. Now f3 is a blunder, because what happens is that their rook on h7 is a little bit loose. I can do rook takes f3, which I did. Queen takes f3. Yeah, queen takes f3, which they didn't play. Then queen g6 check will manage to get the rook. It's a lot less of a complex tactic than the other thing with the whole b3, then queen d6, then queen d1 idea that I had. This idea is pretty simple by comparison. Just win a pawn, have a pass to e-pawn, go to a winning ending. Trading pieces as well. So c5 is a kind of lunge at me, and then I just completely blundered. I thought that queen d3 was a very easy way to trade queens. Just go into a simple ending and win. But I should actually play rook f1 check. I've somehow missed this. King to, say, a2. Then I'm sure that queen e6 will be winning as well, but I think I can just play queen takes c5. One another pawn. I'm still, material up. White has no real way to counterattack, so I should win in the next few moves. And because I forget about rook f1, I think that the only place for my queen that's any good is to check on d3. Because if I move the queen to guard the rook on f3, they can take on c7. If, say, queen f6. So that was a big mistake. Queen d3, they trade queens, then they take on c7. And I see that king a6 might be the best move. But I was worried about rook to c6. And potentially I'm throwing away my advantage. So king to a6, rook to c6. If I defend the pawn with rook b8, they can then do bishop takes e5. And this may end up being a drawn position because of pawn takes pawn. Let's say rook takes. White probably draws this after rook takes, king takes, and then just sits in a fortress with their king on a2. I don't think they even need the g-pawn, although it's nice to have. They can simply, put their bishop on this long diagonal, just go pretty much anywhere, and I don't see how I would break through. So, for example, bishop c3 takes. I know there was bishop d4 winning the rook, but I'm just trying to create a position for the point to be proved. Now here, the only way for black to make progress is, white's going to just keep moving up and down. The only way for black to try and make progress is to play a4, try and sort of stifle the white pawns. But the thing is, black can never even sack the exchange because it's a wing pawn, it's a side pawn. So even if they somehow got the bishop and the two pawns for the rook, it would still be a draw. So black's best shot is to come round with the king, maybe to c2. And then where's the breakthrough? How does black improve? If rook b1, again the bishop is always holding the pawn. There's no checks, there's no attacks of any weak pieces, and there's no way to get the bishop off the long diagonal. There's too many squares for the bishop. Just keep going back and forth. So this would be a draw. That's what I was scared of. So that's why I played king b8 and allowed pawn takes, and then thought that I need to get the pawn running. And unfortunately I sometimes have a tendency to sort of mess up these endings, because I'm sort of feeling like I need to urgently rush this position and quickly shove the pawn up and not consolidate before I do so. So I was scared of white making a blockade. After king c2 I need to save the rook. They play bishop e1 and I push. So white actually has a bishop and 3 pawns for a rook. So materially they're ahead. The good news is though that I have the pawn which will soon win their bishop. White tries pushing their pawns up the board. Best form of attack is to counter. They save the bishop, and I was thinking about playing rook to e3 and sacrificing on c3 with my rook, so that I can queen without it being taken. The thing is though, they're probably not going to fall for this, and after say rook to e3 they can play things like bishop to b4, bishop a5. So instead I queen, and they take, then rook g7, and here I try to get my king active. So I get my rook to the 7th rank to prevent their rook cutting off my king, then bring it up. Then a5 happens, so I attack the weak pawn, and b4. This looks like white has run out of plans, because after I play rook to e3, cutting their king off now, it looks like I have a fairly simple task. I just run the king to b4 and take the pawn. In fact, white appears to be helping me do just this. And play g4. But now, if I play king takes b4, it can get very, very dangerous after a6. So if I play rook check, king goes up, and then I don't want to spoil the game, but if I play, I believe I might have one move which does still just about win, but you can see that I'm really walking on very thin ice here. And let's say I play a move like check, king up, and then rook back down, trying to get the mate on d2. They can always come back round here and go to king c6. And if I try rook to e8, trading rooks, trying to win the game, I'm actually too slow. And chasing after the pawns is futile. White will actually promote. So white's advanced queenside pawns could spell my doom if I don't play this accurately. In fact, just to illustrate my point, if I turn on a computer, it at first may not realise how sort of tricky this position could be, because it will say like, you know, -7 or something. So yeah, -4 just seems to think black's winning easily. But look, now after king takes, it's actually a draw. And now it's switched to say that black is winning. So very, very strange. The computer has no idea what's going on, which it doesn't seem to do in endings. So after a6, it said a6 was a draw. It now says rook d7 is winning, because there's a mate. So if we give white the move b7, very nice checkmating idea. Rook c3, king b2, rook d2, king to b1 to prevent rook c1 mate. Yes, and then king to a3. So what this move does, it threatens both rook to d1 mate and also rook b2 and then rook c1 mate. I can't stop both of them if I was white. So that is actually a mating net, but not easy to see and extremely dangerous to play. So that's why I went with rook to a3 instead of taking the pawn. This prevents white from improving any of their pawns or pieces, so they simply move the king. Now I can take the pawn, and the reason is that a6 still looks like it might work, but I had quite a nice mating attack. After a6, I had rook a2. Now white has 3 places they can move. One of them is just discounted. If king c1, rook e1 mate. But if king to d1, I had seen I could play rook to h7, doing a lawnmower checkmate, or stepladder checkmate, with rook to h1 coming up. And if rook to e8, what's amazing is that, again, the computer is actually somewhat mistaken here. At first, it will say the position is only like -1 something for black. So, for example, here, for a few seconds at least, if I turn the computer on, it will say it's like -1. Then it will quickly jump. There you go. So it said -1 for a few seconds. Now it's saying -55, which is about right. The reason is that it doesn't realize for a while that this position is just a trivial win. I had a position like this, or had lots of positions like this before. If you play it incorrectly, it could be a draw. What you have to do is try to bring your king as close as you can and in front of the pawn as fast as possible. So I'm not making any rook moves, I'm just moving my king, getting it closer and closer and closer. And now, once I've got the king in front of the pawn, the rest is easy. So, for example, check. If the pawn moves up, it makes no difference. King moves back, you have king g7. Pawn up, king h8, white king moves back, king g7, the pawn is lost. And game over. Win for black. So that's a way to win with after king d1. The move in the game was king to d3. And I saw I had a nice mating net with rook on e to d2. E to e2. And the idea is rook a d2 mate. There's no way for white to prevent it. So he resigned before I did the mate. So that's some of my own analysis. So a quick look at the computer analysis. It's quite amusing, at least. It says that in the match, I made 2 inaccuracies, 3 mistakes. It's not bad for a 47 move game. Although some of my moves were losing me some of the advantage, or even giving white a much better position than they deserved, and they're not counted as inaccuracies or mistakes. So I'm not entirely sure on how the algorithm decides what's inaccurate, what's a mistake. Either way, I had a centre pawn average loss of about 39, which is, pretty reasonable. I'd say it's about 2200 level play for that game. My opponent had a lot more mistakes than me, but to be fair, they were in a very difficult position for a loss of the game. And it's one of those positions where black, once they've kind of got out of the mating net sort of thing at move 10 or so, the plan is pretty obvious, which for black is simply to connect the rooks and bring them into the game by any means necessary, really. But white's having to decide on about 4 or 5 key ideas. Let's see where they went wrong and where I went wrong. The first one's amusing. Simon Williams would not be very happy with this. It claims f5 at move 1 is inaccurate. I think it's a bit too harsh. c4, then knight f6. And yeah, g6, I'm probably not going to do this again. h4, d6, h5. And yeah, e4 is the more common move, but rook takes h5 kind of transposes, so I wouldn't really agree that this is inaccurate. e4. Then, yeah, bishop e6 apparently is a slight inaccuracy. Maybe I should do something else. Perhaps something like e6 straight away, or maybe even something weird like bishop g7, queen takes h5, king f8. That might be a better way of playing. So bishop e2. Yeah, apparently bishop f7 is a mistake. I should just play king d7, wandering my king to c8 straight away. Then king d7. And d5 is a mistake. According to the computers, there's both bishop g5 and knight ge2 that are best. Knight ge2, the idea I think is to go to f4 with the knight, then come into e6. So d5 mistake. Then apparently the pawn should get taken, but to be honest, pawn takes seems to lose them a lot of time. Knight h for 3 at least keeps the pressure on. Then queen takes f5, slight mistake, but again I think it's a necessary move. Queen f3, yeah, okay, I likes queen h5 because I can't play h5 myself. This is what I remembered from the game. That afterwards, when I analysed it, it said that h5 was stronger. So knight a6, slight inaccuracy from me. Knight f4, definitely is good. And the computer always likes material, so it seems to be giving black half a pawn in material as an advantage because of the exchange, despite the fact that black's pieces are all somewhat terrible. Knight c5, bishop d2. Then rook f8 is a slight mistake. So see what I mean? It's losing me nearly half a pawn's worth of advantage, but it's not classed as a mistake or inaccuracy. This move felt very natural to me, despite its not being the best move, because it's so easy to play. Just rook f8, pin the knight to the queen, activate the piece, rook on the open file. It just feels extremely principled to do this move. I'm not sure what's stronger than this. Maybe like b6 straight away to get the king to b7. And yeah, my 2 pawn moves, I had felt they were wrong, or at least they weren't as good as I thought they might have been. But the thing is, what was the alternative? It seems to give a5 as minus 0.7, but I just don't like the idea of b4. So king b1, b6. Again, I've lost about 0.7, 0.8 of a advantage in 2 moves, but none of these are classed as being inaccuracies. h1, apparently g3 is stronger, but again this move looks very natural. Play the rook onto the only open file they can use and attack one of my own forces, the h7 pawn. Then I seem to play it quite well. This bishop takes with the idea of e5, trading off lots of minor pieces, is the right move and right plan going into the ending. g3, king b7, e5, and to be honest, every other move besides king a7 just appears to be giving white a lot to use here. So king a7 is pretty obvious, and I did miss queen e4 to be honest, but I did seem to have enough to get me the keep me the advantage. e6, queen takes, rook h7. Then apparently queen d6 is the best move to threaten mate and also guard both pawns simultaneously. a3 is very, very good. Rook h e8, rook a e8. Yeah, and f3 was a mistake because of the whole rook takes f3 plan that I had. Rook h2 is better, but it's not a very nice looking move to play your rook that's very, very good on the 7th and retreat it all the way to just defend the pawn. You'd think that something like king to a2 would be more natural for white. So when I turn it on, I don't know if you saw over here, for just a moment it liked king a2 and it now suggests rook h2 as it says in the analysis. So after king a2, rook takes f2. You know, I always feel if you're going to retreat your pieces like this, or rook h1 and that sort of thing, you've kind of already given up, really. So why is g4 terrible? What's the valuation? Rook f4. Ooh, and it's saying things like queen d5, but queen e2 looks a lot more natural to defend both pawns. Yeah, black's initiative is now too much. White tries to tie me down, but I can keep pushing the pawn. Yeah, this looks too good, actually. It's interesting to see the method of how black wins. Just push the pawn, and yeah, white's best option is to trade the queens, capture a pawn, and a bit like the game, they're going to lose their bishop for a few pawns, but here it might even be worse than the actual game, because I also have a pawn, and white doesn't have any like very strong passed pawns. The only one they have is the a pawn and g pawns, which I can easily pick off, and I can retain the c pawn as well, so it won't be a long grind with like two rooks against rook and 2 pawns, which can be difficult. I can always play if rook c6, rook c1, then if b4 I go c4. b4 is also illegal because their king is on the line of my f2 rook, but the point still stands. I'd always be able to avoid the trade of pawns. So yeah, after f3 I take. Queen takes f3 is the strongest move, but again it just doesn't lead to anywhere good. Black still has the passed pawn. The queen's being on now isn't so bad because white's initiative is gone. Black might even be the one who has a better chances to mate the white king. And look, it was -4, or very nearly, and now it's only -2 after my hasty queen trade. And king b8 is apparently correct. Oh no, it isn't actually. No, it's -1.7 if I go rook king to a6, I would guess. I just thought that this was an easier position to play. So c takes, e4, bishop takes a5, e3. Yeah, I thought rook c1 was better in the game because it allows white to kind of marshal their forces onto e1. The problem is they can't really ever control it enough. So if rook c1 and then e2, they're going to have to play something like bishop e1 sooner or later. They could do this. They could do king c2. Then my guess would be rook d5, bishop to c3, and then maybe rook c8. And how about maybe not rook c8 then? I was thinking about it. Seems to like king b7. So is there something stronger? Oh, rook takes g3, much easier, much easier to play. Then if say bishop to e1, there's always moves like I was thinking rook to g1 would be simple. Maybe march the king up to say b7. Yeah, it's -1, but I think as the game would go on, yeah, if king takes b6, bishop to f2. Oh, it seems to like rook e6. Okay, but yeah, as the game goes on, it's just going to get better and better and better for black. So, for example, rook c7 check is one of the moves. If bishop f2, just take the rook. So rook d7, king say c6, rook to d4, and black can slowly improve. And even though it's saying it's not that much better for black, I think over time it will just start to the position will just start to get stronger and stronger. But it might be one of those very rare circumstances. It could be quite funny if it's one of those rare circumstances where it's a draw with a fortress. If we trade off rooks, maybe it is one of those very rare circumstances. That would be quite interesting. Because the thing is that the king can't actually get over to the pawns. So instead, what has to happen is how does the black king get over? Very interesting, actually, that this could be a trivial draw. So if I go back to rook g3, it's saying -1.4. So I guess it has to be played a lot more accurately than I thought it did. Rook g6, aiming for the pawns. Yeah, again, let's just give white a move. Okay, king b7. Yeah, and then white may end up catching the pawn on e2. And if they can do that, it could well be enough to draw the game. So here I'm assuming b3 is correct, but no, rook b4 or rook h1. Let's do a piece move. Piece moves are usually better. King d5. And if b4, yeah, the pin is actually going to work out very well. And king d3, yeah, rook takes bishop. Okay, so it is winning, but with accurate play, it's winning. But if black is even slightly careless, it could easily be a position where it's a draw. Here's pretty easy. If b5, king c5, simple. And if king b3, the kind of thematic move is to go rook a1. This zugzwangs the white kings, they can't move. And when white moves a pawn, you just blockade it with king here. And even if I give white the option of pushing the pawn up with check, king b7, king b4, and then the zugzwang move, rook a1. Again, white has to push a pawn or they lose the a pawn. The moment they push, your king stands in front. Very simple rook and pawn ending technique. So yeah, it's much more complicated than it looks with that pesky bishop on the board. So after rook d5, which is my simple idea because of white not playing rook c1 but playing king c2, e2, and a4 is apparently a mistake, but I'm not sure how much it actually matters because rook d1 is just going to be so useful. You never know, but the thing that I'd thought of, which I mean might be wrong, but rook to d1, rook to h1, rook to f8. If we give white a move like g4, potentially checking me, I can always play king b7. And the thing is that the moment that white does anything, there's the very simple rook f1. And if black moves the bishop, the rook gets taken. If black moves the rook, the bishop gets taken. So rook takes rook, pawn takes queen, king takes rook, and it's an easy win. The only thing left is to check. King takes, and say bishop c3. Or bishop b4 even. Bishop b4 might be stronger. But it's a very, very simple simple win now, I think. Could make a queen, or could even try to force the bishop off that diagonal. So if rook check, king b7, bishop tries desperately to stay on the diagonal. Take a pawn, force the bishop back, rook d2. Again, if white loses that bishop, it's black can easily just promote for nothing. And now after rook a1, I don't see how the bishop stays on the diagonal. The only square it has where it doesn't get sacrificed is c3, and then rook to c4. Game's over. Rook takes, bishop is coming, followed by e1 queen. So to me, I'm not sure if a4 is any better than rook h7 really. Let's run it quickly through a computer. Rook d1, okay, so it likes bishop a5, but I'm not sure again how much it's going to do. Okay, so apparently a4 is correct, but I think g4 is not going to make any difference. King b7. Yeah, the evaluation's just ticking up slowly. -2, soon it'll be -2.5. Yeah, -2.3. Rook f1. B6. Yeah, bishop b4 is yeah, because rook f2 here, or even rook. What's easier, just rook c1 check, to be honest. If bishop c3, rook c1 check, king moves, and then rook takes bishop. When white takes the rook back, black promotes. So bishop b4 was the only move. And yeah, promoting it's like -2 anyway, but rook d4 to me looked better. And yeah, I'm not sure the computer will catch up until it's entirely obvious. Yeah, it likes rook h7 trying to draw it, but I think I could always zigzag towards the rook. It will take a lot longer, take maybe another 5 moves to zigzag towards the bishop or towards the rook by sort of going, you know, c8, d7, e8, so on, so on. So rook takes, bishop d2, e1 knight apparently is quite a nice move. Oh, okay, rook to e6, I missed that. To e6. Because then if I take the bishop, king takes. So okay, that's what I missed. Rook to e6 is the best move. So instead I do actually have to promote. And after takes. The thing is that if white could keep the 2 pawns together, it might actually be a real struggle for me to win. But because they're so far away, it's very easy for me to get 1 pawn and then focus all my attention on the other one, using my king and my 2 rooks to slowly push white back. And there's no real fortress against 2 rooks working in tandem. So unfortunately it's a loss. So going into the last part of the game, rook d1. Then e1 queen might not be the best move, but it's very simple to play. And I don't think at any point I'm throwing away the advantage. There are some moves I do that are not the most accurate, but they're sufficient to be good enough. But I didn't make things that easy for myself. I really had to look hard after rook a3, king d2. To be fair, that's a very natural move, king d2. It did take a bit of effort to find king takes b4 because of a6. Where I think if I don't find the mate, it's actually going to be a drawn position, which could be embarrassing. So that's why I had to look very hard before I did king takes b4. And luckily, this move is unavoidable mate. So I won the game. So that was the first game of the Four Nations Chess League. There'll be another game in 2 weeks, where I will most likely be playing somebody over 2,000 FIDE. On this website they might be a bit less than that. He's only 1842. because he hasn't played many games. But hopefully they'll be this interesting. Anyway, I hope you got something from this video, and see you next time. Bye.